Welcome to British Accent Podcast. Hello and welcome back to the British Accent Podcast, the place where we help you improve your English skills and boost your confidence in speaking. I'm Emma, and today we're diving into a big question. Is English really the hardest language to learn?
That's a great question, Emma, because so many learners say English is difficult. The confusing grammar rules, inconsistent spelling, phrasal verbs, there's a lot to deal with. But is it actually the hardest language? Or does it just feel that way to learners?
Exactly. Today, we're going to break down what makes English tricky, what actually makes it easier than some other languages, and whether English deserves its reputation as one of the hardest languages to learn. So, let's get into it.
All right, so let's start with what makes English difficult. One of the biggest complaints from learners is spelling. Unlike languages like Spanish or Italian, where words are spelled exactly how they sound, English is full of inconsistencies. Think about words like though, through, and tough. They all have O, but sound completely different.
Yes, and even native speakers struggle with spelling sometimes. Another tricky part is pronunciation. English has so many sounds that don't exist in other languages. For example, the TH sound in this, and think many learners find it difficult because it's not in their native language.
Right, and let's not forget phrasal verbs. These drive learners crazy. Take, give up, give in, and give away. They all have give, but completely different meanings. You can't always guess the meaning just from the words.
And idioms. English is full of them. If someone says it's raining cats and dogs, a learner might think animals are falling from the sky. So all these things can make English feel very unpredictable.
But let's look at the other side. English has some easy parts too, right?
Definitely, compared to languages like Russian or German, English grammar is actually simpler in some ways. For example, we don't have complex noun cases. And the verb conjugations are quite simple. Most verbs only change slightly for different subjects, like I play, you play, we play.
Exactly. In many other languages, you have to memorize different endings for every verb and every subject. English keeps it quite straightforward. Plus, there are no gendered nouns like in French or Spanish, so that's one less thing to worry about.
That's true. And another reason English is easier to learn than some languages is how available it is. You hear it in movies, music, and on the internet all the time, so there are more opportunities to practice.
Great point. So, is English really the hardest language to learn? Maybe not. It has its challenges, but it also has advantages. It really depends on your native language and your exposure to English.
Exactly. If your native language is similar to English, like Dutch or German, you might find it easier. But if your first language is something completely different, like Mandarin or Arabic, then English might feel much harder.
That's a great point. The more similarities your native language has with English, the easier it is to pick up. But even if English is very different from your language, it doesn't mean it's impossible to learn. You just need the right strategies.
Speaking of strategies, let's talk about what learners can do to make learning English easier. One thing I always recommend is focusing on communication first. Instead of stressing about every grammar rule, just try to get your point across. Mistakes are part of the process.
Yes, that's so important. A lot of learners get stuck because they're afraid of making mistakes. But think about how kids learn their first language. They don't worry about grammar at first. They just speak and improve naturally over time.
Right. Another tip is to immerse yourself in English as much as possible. Watch movies, listen to music, read books, and even try to think in English. The more you surround yourself with the language, the faster you'll learn.
And don't forget about speaking. A lot of learners focus too much on reading and writing. But speaking is a skill you need to practice. Even if you don't have a native speaker to talk to, you can still practice by recording yourself or using apps that connect you with other learners.
Exactly. The more you speak, the more confident you'll become. So, while English might seem hard at first, with the right approach, it's definitely possible to master it.
Absolutely. And another thing that helps is setting small, achievable goals. Instead of saying, I want to be fluent, which can feel overwhelming, try setting goals like, I want to learn 5 new words every day, or I'll have a short conversation in English this week. Small wins keep you motivated.
That's such good advice. Progress isn't always about big leaps, it's about steady, consistent improvement. And speaking of motivation, I think one of the biggest reasons people struggle with English is because they don't find ways to make it fun.
Exactly. If you only study with textbooks and grammar exercises, you'll probably feel frustrated. But if you mix it up watching English YouTube videos, listening to podcasts, playing games in English, it feels less like work and more like an enjoyable experience.
And when something is fun, you naturally stick with it longer. That's why I always recommend learners find something they love in English, whether it's a TV show, a book series, or even following English-speaking influencers on social media.
That's a great tip. And another thing, don't compare yourself to others. Everyone learns at their own pace. Just because someone else picks up English quickly doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. Stay focused on your own journey.
Absolutely, learning a language is personal, and the most important thing is to keep going. Even when it feels hard, just remind yourself why you started in the first place.
That's a really important point. Everyone's journey with English is different, and sometimes progress happens in ways we don't immediately notice. Maybe your listening skills improve first, or maybe you start recognizing more words in conversations before you feel confident enough to speak.
Exactly, and sometimes we get stuck because we're too focused on perfection. But real communication isn't about being perfect, it's about being understood. Even native speakers make mistakes all the time.
That's so true. If you're always worried about making mistakes, you might never speak at all. But if you embrace mistakes as part of the process, you'll improve much faster. And most of the time, people won't even notice small mistakes if you're speaking confidently.
Confidence is key, and I think another great way to build confidence is by practicing with people in real situations. Even small things like ordering food in English or asking for directions can make a big difference.
Definitely. And if you don't have many chances to practice in person, you can always use language exchange apps or join online communities where people practice English together. The more you use the language, the more natural it feels.
That's such a good idea. And speaking of natural, one last tip: try to think in English as much as possible. Even if you're just describing what you're doing in your head, it helps you get used to forming sentences without translating.
Yes, thinking in English is a game changer. At first, it might feel unnatural, but over time, it becomes a habit. Start with simple things like naming objects around you or describing what you're doing. Then, gradually try forming full sentences in your head.
And don't forget the power of immersion. If you surround yourself with English through music, podcasts, movies, or even setting your phone's language to English, you'll start to pick up phrases and sentence structures naturally.
That's a great point. And when you're watching movies or listening to podcasts, try shadowing. Repeat what you hear immediately after the speaker. It helps with pronunciation and fluency.
Oh yes, shadowing is amazing. It trains your brain to think in English faster and helps with your accent too. Plus, it makes you more comfortable speaking at a natural pace.
Exactly. And remember, learning English isn't a race. Some days will feel easier than others, and that's okay. The important thing is to stay consistent and enjoy the process.
Right, the more fun you make it, the more motivated you'll be to keep going. So, find what works for you and stick with it.
And another great way to train your brain to think in English is to have inner conversations with yourself. Instead of translating from your native language, try forming sentences in English directly in your head.
Yes, for example, if you're walking down the street, describe what you see in English. Say things like, "The weather is nice today," or "I see a red car passing by." This simple practice makes a big difference.
And if you're stuck on a word, don't switch back to your native language. Instead, try explaining the word in English. For example, if you forget the word fridge, you can say, "The thing where I keep my food cold." This helps your brain stay in English mode.
That's a really useful trick. And another tip: when you're writing messages, challenge yourself to write them in English. Even if you're texting a friend in your native language, try thinking of the message in English first.
Oh, I love that one. Writing helps reinforce your thinking skills, and over time, it will feel more natural. Plus, journaling in English is a great habit. Just write about your day, your goals, or even how you're feeling.
Yes, and if you're into social media, follow English-speaking content creators. The more English you consume, the easier it becomes to think in it.
Absolutely. And let's not forget, mistakes are part of the process. Don't be afraid to make them. The more you practice thinking in English, the more natural it will become.
So, to wrap things up, if you want to stop translating in your head and start thinking in English, immerse yourself in the language, practice inner conversations, describe what you see, and challenge yourself to write in English as much as possible.
Exactly. And remember, it's all about consistency. The more you expose your mind to English, the more natural it will feel over time. Be patient with yourself and enjoy the process.
That's it for today's episode of Podcast Name. If you found this helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share this with a friend who's learning English too.
And let us know what's your favorite way to practice thinking in English. Send us a message or leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye for now.
Bye.